Hey, Pratik, thanks for joining me here. I am excited to discuss the nature of how you came about creating Omnichain, and I think it's just a fantastic story. But before we get into the background of Omnichain, I want to hear from your voice because you and I have talked about this before, kind of what your background is and where you came from and kind of what led up to your experience in supply chain management. Give us a brief history of yourself. Where'd you grow up and when were you first introduced to blockchain? And a little bit about your education and experience.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, first of all, awesome. I love sharing the origin story and talking about it. The thing that is always odd for anybody is tell me your background, but I'll try to keep it as tight and relevant as possible. But yeah, I mean, my personal backstory is really, my family and I migrated to the United States when I was at the age of 4. So I think that was 1987. Migrated to U.S. after my father had just passed away. I mean, I was about a year old when he passed away, and I was 4 years old when we migrated to the U.S. And kind of through that time, that's kind of really where you kind of learn a new way of life, right, in a new environment, in a new country, and kind of seeing that struggle that my mom had to go through to kind of put kind of 3 kids through school and making sure we had food and education and everything on our backs. Obviously, we had a tremendous family network that helped us throughout that entire journey as well. Essentially, that was the kind of kickstart of learning a good kind of work ethic, right? And having my mom, seeing her go through numerous night shifts and multiple jobs and so on and so forth, really kind of showed that, hey, you kind of have to work really hard in life to really achieve your goals and dreams. And my first kind of encounter with just overall supply chain, and at that time I didn't even know what it was my first job was at a barber salon, kind of sweeping hair, so that way I can essentially get free haircuts, right? So I would essentially get a kind of a couple of dollars an hour, and then I would then get kind of haircuts as I needed through the barbers and the friends I would make with them. And then that progressed into essentially me being a stockkeeper, right? So I had to order the inventory for the salon, so that way we had enough shampoo and conditioner and whatever other materials and merchandise that the salon needed. So kind of that was my first introduction to, say, inventory control and management.
Yeah,
And
knowing
then that
what to buy and when to buy it. Demand planning.
exactly,
There was
and that was
oh
all
no, we're out of shampoo. We got to reorder shampoo.
exactly. It's all done on a kind of piece of paper, right, on a weekly basis that I just gave to my boss or the shop manager and said, okay, this is what we need, net, right? Before kind of technology essentially was there to do that. And then that would pique my interest into, kind of just overall this type of operational work. And then kind of fast forward throughout my university and throughout my rest of my work life experience, I was able to get into programs through work studies. So that way I would essentially be able to work full time and then have that company essentially pay for my college tuition. So in this scenario, I was essentially working at Home Depot. Originally started off as a logistics coordinator, and then went full time, and then paid for my university as well, as I did university part time. So essentially, did a lot of these organizational work, and then ultimately post university decided to expand and advance my supply chain thirst, right? Because I really fell in love with the operational supply chain career field. Because there's so many facets to it, you can work in many different areas within supply chain. So I decided to further find my skill. So I went after my Six Sigma certifications, my Black Belt certifications, and then ultimately my Apex certifications to essentially move into kind of Fortune 500 organizations and start working in bigger supply chains at scale. So that was essentially my kind of my personal origin story around kind of my background, where I come from, and then kind of what led me into the supply chain kind of field or industry, and kind of how I navigated through that during school life and then college life and so on.
Cool. That's really interesting. An evolution into the supply chain world, and what piqued your interests, as well as what led you into your educational path and future work. Now, I know you work for both large and as well as small startup companies. So what kind of supply chain management solutions did you use while you were working for those organizations?
Yeah, great question. Geez, all sorts, many different types of solutions, right? So in some small organizations, we obviously used Excel and Google Sheets, right, to share data back and forth between teams and between partners. And in some of the large Fortune 500 organizations, we used SAP, we used Oracle, very large, massive ERP systems that not only just do supply chain, but do HR and everything related to it. But what I essentially found is there was never really a right size solution for any organization, right? I've worked at organizations where it's a small organization, but they have a really complex, over-engineered ERP system, and that almost ties you up in knots. And then in some cases, I've worked at really large Fortune 100 companies where the ERP system is non-existent. It may be for financial purposes, but not necessarily operationally. It's really non-existent, right? You're doing everything offline and manual. So I've always really found it, kind of quite curious to be like, why do some organizations choose one thing over the other? Obviously, there's so many different determining factors that drive that decision making, but sometimes it almost feels like it was never the right for any organization. It was never really the right fit or type of solution, in my operator days, right? When looking back at it.
Yeah, it sounds like, whether it was a small company or a large company, that there were a lot of struggles that you always kind of had to battle. And you and I have talked about the extensive use with spreadsheets in all these organizations, regardless of what their tech stack was. And so what kind of struggles did you experience in working with these other types of systems, and how did that play out?
Yeah. I mean, no, look, beyond the struggles of the tech stack alone, it's just operational struggles mostly, right? Around availability of data when you need data, right? So if I remember my days as a retail supply planner, and essentially the latency of data as it goes from our partners' systems and into our system at the time was just not fast enough at the point of how we want to quickly turn that data into actionable insight. And it would be sent over in Excel files and stitching data together. And also, can we trust the data that's coming across? How many different hands have changed or touched the data? And is this data even, trustworthy when it comes to being able to input it and drive additional calculations against it or planning against it, right? So struggles around, just visibility and sharing of data, struggles around the latency in the data and at the essentially the confidence of the data as well are some of the examples of some of the struggles. And then once you finally are able to get all the data that you need, then that struggle of putting it all together is the other journey, right? Other struggle that at least I experienced, in my operational time, and then making something of that data, right? So as you're stitching together multiple spreadsheets and running multiple, say, scenarios and macros and offline Excel workbooks, does the data make sense? Does it make sense? How do we make sense of the data to get to where we need to be from a decision-making perspective, right? So some of these struggles essentially, led me to ask the questions around, why do we have to do this? Like, why, I work for one of the largest tech companies, consumer product and technology companies in the world. Why are we still having to do this? Why can't we just kind of snap our finger and have somebody fix it, or a technology that fixes it, right? So again, it's a couple of different things from a struggle perspective is around, it makes you think around what is that better path or the ideal path, or it also makes you as an operator kind of be resourceful, right? So what can I do to essentially streamline my process of gathering the data, collecting the data, making sense of the data, and then the output, right? How do I get better at get the output of the data? So these struggles are real, and we talk to, and I talk to hundreds of companies monthly, and this is the same struggle that's still out there, which is crazy to me.
Yeah, it really is. It's interesting that you could be part of such a large organization and still having kind of these disjointed systems and processes. And man, I'll bet a lot of tribal knowledge too that's just inside of the heads of individuals that is not documented anywhere in any standard operating procedure or anything like that. And if somebody leaves, what happens to that knowledge? And consistency of systems and processes. And it seems like it just blows my mind. So tell me about kind of your epiphany and how that translated over into where you are now.
Yeah, well, I mean, it kind of led to around asking questions around, looking at, in the corporate environment, right? In a large organization, you have teams of people working to maybe to move that organization forward operationally and from a supply chain perspective. They're massive teams, really smart, great people. But then you start asking yourself, wait, why does my team or myself, why do we still have to spend hours and hours a day, a week, a month doing all of these manual processes when we have, so many new great systems out there and technologies out there that can, help us, right? Help us drive to the end outcome that we want with more accuracy, faster, better. It'll, the team will be happy. It'll essentially make our kind of work-life balance more smooth as well. So essentially, I started kind of asking the question about myself, or what is out there, or what can we do, or what can I do to essentially help the organization or help myself and the team get better at understanding what technologies are out there. And that led to the epiphany of why doesn't an end-to-end system and solution exist that is fully horizontally integrated as well as vertically integrated based off of form and function. So what I essentially did was I started looking at existing technologies that are out there in the marketplace, anywhere from your traditional ERP systems or your point solutions, and then essentially looked at new technologies such as blockchain and distributed ledger and AI and machine learning to see, are there any use cases around a combination of blockchain and machine learning and artificial intelligence in use for supply chain. And the more and more I found and the more I researched, the more and more the data showed that, hey, there is a huge need for it in the marketplace in the next 5 to 10 years, but there aren't any solutions out there in the marketplace now, right? And this was back, I want to say, in 2016 when it started this kind of whole journey and the epiphany happening. So my thought was, okay, great. There's the technology and our industry and as supply chain purists are heading in this direction of technology. There aren't known or wide public, organizations that are solving these types of problems with this technology. And essentially there is an entire organizational as well as supply chain technologist kind of purist movement to leverage latest and greatest technology to advance our industry forward. So my thought was, okay, there isn't a silver bullet, right? A supply chain is one of the, I'd say, the most complex things that you can essentially design, or one of the most simplified things you can design and architect. There isn't a silver bullet, especially when it comes to supply chain, and especially when it comes to solving for supply chain problems, right? So my thought is, knowing that there's never going to be a silver bullet, how do you take a multitude of latest and greatest technology, as well as learning from existing technology, and combine it into what we like to call essentially an end-to-end complete solution, right? So taking the best of what's already out there and taking the best of what's going to be out there and merging it into that complete holistic solution. And this is kind of that epiphany that I had in circa the 2016 era when we went down the path of, okay, I think we have a solution. Let's go and start, putting it together, right?
And you mentioned blockchain, and it just blows my mind. It's wild because not too long after that, I personally started doing research, and with decades of experience in the supply chain world, working for big technology companies. When I started peeling back what is blockchain beyond cryptocurrency, the implications of blockchain and what it could bring, what kind of value could it bring to our world outside of crypto, and looking at it as it related to me and what I knew and what I, had worked so long in, and the opportunity, it was like, holy cow, there's a real opportunity for a blockchain solution within the supply chain management world. So, as I started to really take a look at that and understand that, it opened my eyes, and I really couldn't find anything out there as well. So what was your vision as it relates to that piece of really unique kind of leading edge technology, and what, how could it be applied to the supply chain solutions?
Yeah. So great question. So how I kind of started researching into blockchain was through a friend and a partner of the company, right? A partner of Omni, and one of the advisors is through a gentleman named Ray Young, who at the time was doing up some really cool things in the blockchain space for media and entertainment and royalties, right? Especially when it comes to around sharing content. So essentially, he has a company that essentially allows content producers to immediately publish your piece of content, whether it's images or videos or whatever, into the blockchain network, automatically authenticate that as your own kind of content, and then as it gets redistributed for royalties or what have you, there's a track and traceability against it. So my thought was, okay, well, hey, you're doing, there's an awesome use case for blockchain in the content space, because as we all know, a lot of people may not end up getting royalties for their video or their picture that they get, that they create, right? So my thought was, okay, well, why can't that content be a piece of widget of inventory? And how do we essentially see, I made a widget today, and I want to see the life cycle of this widget till the end of time, right? Will blockchain allow me to do that if specific things were in place, right? So everyone authenticated, whenever that widget changed hands or changed ownership, there was a mechanism to capture that. So essentially, the vision there was, how do we take a widget and then track its entire life cycle from cradle to grave on a blockchain network, right, or a distributed ledger network? And that's where kind of the initial kickstart of that idea of creating a platform that was end to end, that essentially uses not only blockchain but additional technologies to drive transparency, traceability from source to shelf, and automate workflows along the way, right? And help the supply chain participants that are part of that blockchain network or that distributed ledger network, help them drive visibility up and down the entire supply chain network, so that way they can do what they need to do to be proactive as opposed to reactive. So that was really that entire vision of how we wanted to use the multitude of technologies that we're now using in current day to deliver value to the entire supply chain kind of network, if that makes sense, right? Again, this is really streamlining the path of planning and execution for the entire supply chain, not just me as an operator working for one company within the supply chain, but how do you essentially lift the entire supply chain network, right? Because as you know, Jeff, supply chain is a team sport. It's not a solo sport. So how do we drive value and shared business value across the entire supply chain so everybody within the supply chain wins? And for me, that platform and that mentality never existed, when we embarked on this journey. And now, this is what we're driving as Omnichain is bringing and uplifting the entire supply chain to drive value across the network.
How did you take it from concept to reality? And what did that whole process look like in terms of, you had this, epiphany and idea and problems you had experienced, and learning about, some of these new types of technologies, and started building a framework in your head. And then, all of a sudden you're, I'm sure, thinking, well, how do I create a solution out of this? And what did that whole process look like?
Yeah. That's a great question, right? As we look at it, that's essentially, what are the steps to commercialize your idea, right? For me as an operator first, right? As an operator, having lived my entire career as an operator, my kind of thought was, okay, well, we need to solve the operators' problems, right? What are the problems that I face, the struggles that face when doing my work. How do I eliminate those struggles? So we essentially, work together to drive the product first, right? So if we have a product, a platform that is essentially a market viable product that we can show and use case specific clients or a handful of clients and show that success, that's what we essentially went with first. So we essentially went with the product focus first. So we built out a really kind of great product, right? That solved problems for the operator. It solved problems for supply chain participants, whether you're a supplier or distribution center or a warehouse or customer. So we essentially solved and tackled that head on by developing the product first, having a product first focus and an operator and a user first focus. And then we worried about essentially the other side of the house, right? So, the demand. So the old idea of if you build it, they'll come, right? So that's what we essentially went with, right? If you build it, they'll come. So we built a great initial product and brought on initial customers and showed that success, showed that the vision could come to life, and it does work, right? You can drive shared business value through a distributed ledger network in some cases, and leveraging machine learning and leveraging artificial intelligence and it being able to scale it. And then once we showed proof points, that's when we then decided to commercialize it, obviously, and we had investor meetings and raised some money and built out entire sales organizations, built a company, right? And that's when the demand piece started kind of rolling in, right? Then we essentially had a product, we were able to market it. We knew exactly how to navigate and where our product market fit came from, and then just doubled down and kept doubling down on a product. And my whole kind of thought, and as I look back at it, was having product focus and the user focus in mind is always going to be successful, because if you're solving problems for the actual users of your platform and the users of the supply chain and the participants of the supply chain, that's the value that you want to go and create. And that's what's going to help essentially create that network effect to drive demand for the product as well, right? So with that in mind, and again, as you know, we're on, I want to say, Gen 3 of our platform, of our product, and we continue to do that. And we have a product focus and we have a user focus in mind and a kind of supply chain focus, right? And as we continue to deliver value across the various participants, the users and the partners, I don't think that demand piece is going to be an issue. It's going to come to fruition and through that network effect.
I know one of the challenges, when you're talking about new technology that is kind of still proving itself in the marketplace, is explaining and helping, kind of demystify what's perceived in the marketplace. And when you start talking about blockchain, I know me personally, when my friends and relatives knew that I was getting involved with Omnichain and there was a blockchain component, their immediate knee-jerk reaction is, what are you getting involved in cryptocurrency for? And I'm like, oh, wait, time out. Doesn't have anything to do with cryptocurrency, because that was the only thing that they had heard related to blockchain. And that's kind of the shiny new object out there today. And people are fascinated with or aware of it as it relates to cryptocurrency. And I've found that it's a challenge to try to simplify it so that essentially, your grandmother could understand it or your 5-year-old could understand it. And if you could, explain it in a 5 seconds or less, so people go, aha, then that's pretty powerful. What do you think relative to skepticism and the marketplace's understanding of blockchain, especially as it relates to supply chain management and the movement of inventory? What do you think the solution is to trying to help the marketplace understand what the opportunity is with blockchain and as it relates to supply chain?
I think there's a lot of great, now as of 2021, right? There's lots of great examples and actual even examples that we publish and case studies we publish as a company on how blockchain for supply chain is very beneficial. But to your point, Jeff, early on, in the life cycle of the company and the technology, we had to really differentiate and say, hey, we're not a cryptocurrency. We're simply, leveraging blockchain or a distributed ledger as as a utility to drive transparency and connectivity within supply chain participants, right? And nothing wrong with cryptocurrency. It has its own kind of world, and that's great, right? But the key kind of difference here was, in our view, in our vision, really is, how do you connect an entire network of organizations on a single foundational decentralized network, which is blockchain, to then drive, share, and essentially be more proactive when it comes to transactional data, right? Perfect example that we all know, Walmart and IBM paired up to track and trace the origins of specific leafy greens, like avocados and iceberg lettuce and so on, right? So you can essentially track and have a ledger of every single time that specific unit moved or changed hands, and his entire journey from, say, farm all the way to kind of the produce shelf, right? And being able to scan that and see that entire journey. So for us, that skepticism and how we dealt with that was driving a lot of thought leadership, right? We walk the walk and talk the talk. We published lots of case studies around how we benefited our customer base with the technology that we bring to the market, as well as essentially we have specific patents in the space as well, right? So we have IP around how to leverage and use a blockchain or distributed ledger network to integrate the different players and participants in the supply chain, regardless of what blockchain protocol they're using, right? So we're always thinking ahead. We're thinking about innovation, and we do understand that the learning curve for blockchain is obviously still evolving, right? And the use cases for blockchain and supply chain continues to evolve and refine itself and show the value as well at the same time. So we're right with it. And at the end result, what we essentially decided was, again, like I said earlier, there isn't really a silver bullet, right? So blockchain is not a silver bullet that's going to solve all of the world's problems, specifically when it comes to supply chain. It's understanding and knowing when and how to leverage a technology to solve the problems for a specific client and their specific goals, objectives when it comes to the supply chain, right? So in some cases, we have clients that only use us for distributed ledger and blockchain services to integrate their entire network of partners through our technology. Or we have some partners that use a hybrid approach where they're using our traditional supply chain technologies, right? Your demand planning, forecasting, replenishment, on top of a distributed ledger network that brings transparency upstream and downstream in their supply chain. Or we have some participants that or clients that essentially only use us for specific modules, right? So for us, we realize that you got to have a best of breed approach, and there isn't a one size fits all approach that you need to you can take. You have to be able to be nimble, flexible, but offer a solution, a comprehensive end-to-end solution to our clients. Focus on what's important for them immediately, short and midterm, and then evolve that client through the use of technology as well. So that way it aligns to their internal technology roadmap as well as their internal adoption, timeline as well to new technology.
Yeah. So what I guess what I heard you say is that it's very much an enabler that can help depending on the situation and the needs of the client, rather than it's end all be all to all the problems. So it's part of the infrastructure, not necessarily the solution, and I've heard recently a lot of illustrations relative to traceability and being able to do recalls in 30 seconds as opposed to 2 weeks for organizations. It was a case study I read for one large big box retailer that had to do a recall, and that was the olden days, couple weeks, and now it's down to a matter of seconds. So it's really an enabler. Can you talk about some of the other technology that Omnichain leverages that's kind of in the background that are also enablers, that essentially the end user doesn't have to really worry about, yet it makes their job easier?
Yeah, and I think we're obviously a cloud native platform, right? So just being on a cloud, it simplifies the user experience as well. So, they can be, especially now with remote work, they can be in their home office or anywhere log on to our platform through our secured login protocol and start working away within our platform. And then kind of behind the scenes, right, our use of machine learning and artificial intelligence, right, which I think is a big value add to the operators, right? Again, we're by operators for operators. So with the operator and the user in mind, our ability to essentially take, say transactional data that happens across your supply chain and through the platform, and then compute that transactional data to deliver insights and recommended action against those insights through our AI and machine learning capabilities is quite beneficial to the user, right? Because now we're having them get out of doing all of these manual workflows and processes by simply, your traditional ERP system, your legacy ERP system is really an input and output, right? It inputs data and you can export out transactions or reports and stuff like that. So you still need to then do a lot of work offline. Whereas for us, with our platform, what we've essentially built into the workflows is really the vertical integration as well. So from a, say, planning perspective, we can take historical transactional information, compute it, and say, hey, you should be building or buying or procuring or manufacturing X number of units to be able to hit your, whatever 13-week forecast, right? And then the user can essentially gain those insights and then click a button to execute against that build plan or recommendation, right? And then the entire workflow kind of automates itself and between their ERP and the suppliers and the participants, right? So automation of these workflows. And then number kind of two is really the effective collaboration and communication, across the network, right? So being exception managed throughout the platform really then alerts specific participants, either internally or externally within your supply chain, of critical bits of information. Say, hey, this specific shipment is going to be late. So you can probably notify your client or your customer, or this supplier is likely going to be missing this PO shipment, right? So this is the knock-on impact to your existing inventory, right? So that driving effective collaboration and communication and S&OP processes across not only the supply chain horizontally, but also across organizations vertically as well, is what we're able to go and drive that real transformation.
Interesting. Yeah. So what I heard is that there's automation in the background that is, in my history and in the systems I've worked with, as elaborate as their, say, demand forecasting engines were, there was still an operator that had to constantly be proving that it's working correctly. And if it isn't, going through, and adjusting the valves and the levers and, tweaking the parameters so that it was being optimized. And so that required a human to do that. And what I heard you say, I think, is that with machine learning, there's this kind of self-tuning capability that exists so that you don't necessarily have to worry about that part of your workload. You can simply, do your job. And what I really took away from what you said is that the individuals can migrate over into more of a proactive work environment versus a reactive firefighting type of environment. And that the other thing that you said was in terms of automating workflow. And I kind of see that as, the passing of the baton. I do something that is required for my job within the organization that affects somebody else in their job, and that baton is then automatically passed so that that individual's work is served up to them proactively, effectively eliminating bottlenecks.
Exactly right. And the key thing here also, Jeff, is when we go to that proactive versus reactive approach, it's also our ability and our platform's ability to essentially know when to be proactive and when not to, right? And when the operator has full control over the platform, that's a great thing, right? It's not necessarily a black box. Perfect example, in 2020 with COVID, demand volatility was massive, right? So in some cases, some of our customers turned off the machine learning because they wanted to retune and work with us to retune and retweak the modeling. So we had to turn off and I'm thinking of it as a switch, but not necessarily a switch, but you turn off the machine learning side of the house so you can essentially look and say, okay, well, how do we go and now compute this modeling based off of this new demand volatility that we have? And then, kind of turn it back on, quote unquote, right? So the ability for the user to have full control over the outcome is also a key element, right? Because we do, again, want to make sure that from a delivery perspective, the users, the operators, they're the ones that know their business and their supply chain like the back of their hand, that tribal knowledge, right? So we want to enable that and carry that all the way throughout the user experience as well. So that way, it's right-sized for them from a solution perspective.
Wow, that's fantastic. Hey, thanks a lot, Pratik. This really will help individuals and groups and companies understand end-to-end where and how Omnichain came about, why it came about, and what we're solving for, and how we're moving forward to help brands and manufacturers, distributors run more effectively and efficiently.
Thank you, Jeff. It was a pleasure. I look forward to our next discussion.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.